When I found the apartment listing, it felt good to be able to live on my own. The price was shockingly low, especially for something so close to campus. The landlord had been polite but distant, responding to my questions in brief messages. He never met me in person, leaving the keys under the mat for my move-in. The flat was small but well kept, with a slightly outdated charm. I moved my belongings in, arranging the space to feel like home. I didn't know the history of the place, not until a neighbor casually mentioned it while I was checking my mailbox. She said tenants didn't seem to last long here, no one could say why, but people moved out suddenly, leaving furniture and personal items behind. One girl, she whispered, had just disappeared entirely. Her things were found untouched, and no one knew where she had gone. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard faint creaks in the walls. It was an old building, so I dismissed it as the structure settling. Over the next few days, the sounds persisted, soft thuds and scratches that seemed to follow me from room to room. One evening, I came home after class and noticed something odd. A chair at the small dining table had been moved, angled slightly away from the others. I was sure I hadn't left it that way, but I convinced myself I was imagining things. Then it happened again. My books, neatly stacked on the desk, were scattered when I returned. The curtains, always closed, were half open one afternoon. I began locking my bedroom door at night, even though I was alone. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, especially in the evenings when the flat was silent. I decided to search for more information about the apartment. Online forums were full of vague stories about strange disappearances connected to the building. One post stood out, a girl describing the same creaking noises and moved furniture. The post ended abruptly with no follow-up. I couldn't sleep that night. I kept my lamp on, watching the door and listening for the faint sounds behind the walls. Around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an account I didn't recognize. Attached was a link. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. It led to a site, a grimy, hidden corner of the internet. My stomach turned as I saw a gallery of photos. They were of me. Some were from inside the flat, me sitting at my desk, cooking in the kitchen, sleeping in my bed. Others were of moments I thought were private, changing clothes, showering, reading in my underwear. I felt sick, my hands trembling as I scrolled. The captions were worse. They described what I was doing in each picture, alongside leering comments from strangers. One mentioned the creaks in the walls, joking about how close he must have been when taking the photo. I grabbed a flashlight and searched the flat, shining it into every dark corner. Then I noticed it, small holes in the walls, barely visible unless you knew to look. The worst discovery was the hatch. It was hidden in the back of the bedroom closet, covered by old paint and wallpaper. I pulled it open, revealing a crawl space. The stench of damp and rot hit me immediately. Inside were blankets, empty food containers, and a phone propped on a tripod. The screen displayed a live feed of my bedroom. I ran. The police found evidence that the landlord had been living in the crawl spaces, sneaking into the flat when I wasn't home and filming me through hidden cameras. He had done this to other tenants too. I dropped out of university and moved back home. I don't sleep without checking every corner of my room. Even now, I sometimes wake up convinced I can hear faint creaks in the walls. The plan seemed airtight. We were desperate and fed up, all of us pushed to our limits by years of underhanded dealings, unpaid overtime, and unethical demands from our employer. It wasn't just a bad boss, it was an empire of greed built on fraud and manipulation. We were all accomplices in some way, knowingly or not, and if the authorities ever came knocking, it wouldn't be the CEO taking the fall, it would be us. It started as a joke, one of those late-night, half-drunk conversations after another exhausting week. What if we staged a kidnapping, get some quick cash from the company's coffers, and disappear before they ever suspected? The more we talked about it, the more plausible it seemed. They'd paid off bigger sums to silence regulators and cover scandals before. What was a few $100,000 for one of their valued employees? We planned it down to the smallest detail. Max, the loudest and most fearless of us, volunteered to be the victim. He'd go missing on a Friday night, giving us the weekend to put the plan into motion. We crafted a ransom note, used burner phones, and rehearsed our alibis until they were flawless. None of us trusted each other completely, but we trusted our shared hatred of the company enough to move forward. The night it all began, everything went smoothly. Max sent a last-minute text to his supervisor saying he was heading out of town for a family emergency. We drove him to an old cabin in the woods we'd rented under a fake name. He'd stay there, lying low, while we sent the ransom demand. The following morning, we sent the message. We waited, tense but exhilarated, as the hours ticked by. Then around midday, we received confirmation. The company was arranging the payment. A wave of relief swept over us. It was working. That relief was short-lived. When we returned to the cabin to check on Max, he wasn't there. We thought he'd panicked and left. The cabin showed no signs of struggle, but his things, his bag, his phone, even his shoes were still there. We searched the surrounding woods, calling his name, but found no sign of him. We argued endlessly, trying to piece together what had happened. None of us admitted to anything, but suspicion hung in the air like a storm cloud. By nightfall, we were on edge, jumpy at every sound outside the cabin. Then the texts started. They came from Max's burner phone, which we'd left in the cabin. The first message was a single word: run. Another followed a few minutes later: they know. Then came a photo. It was a blurry image of one of us, taken from behind. The timestamp showed it had been taken just minutes earlier outside the cabin. We locked the doors, huddling together as fear set in. We tried to call Max's real phone, but it went straight to voicemail. When we attempted to contact the company to cancel the ransom demand, the burner phone we used to send it wouldn't dial out. The next morning, we discovered someone had slashed the tires on our car. We were trapped. By the third day, another one of us was gone. Amy had gone out to gather firewood while the rest of us stayed inside. She didn't scream, didn't make a sound. One minute she was there and the next she wasn't. We found her phone by the edge of the woods. On it was a new video. Amy sitting somewhere dark, tied to a chair. She wasn't moving and her eyes were wide with terror. A voice whispered something we couldn't make out before the screen went black. It was then we realized we weren't in control. The truth became clearer with every passing hour. The company had known about our plan from the start. Max wasn't the first to disappear. They had used our scheme against us, luring us into isolation, cutting us off from help. This wasn't a ransom for them, it was a purge. We were the loose ends, the ones who knew too much. By the fifth day, only I was left. I don't know how they got the others. I never heard their screams. The cabin is silent now, except for the faint sounds of footsteps outside. They've been circling for hours. Flowers arrived on a Monday morning, a bouquet so large it barely fit through the door. There was no card, but I assumed it was from a fan. It wasn't unusual. Being on TV meant I got gifts now and then. I left them on the counter and forgot about them. The letters started a week later. They were handwritten, pages and pages of admiration. He called himself my biggest supporter and spoke about how my show had changed his life. There was nothing threatening in the words. I told my publicist, who brushed it off as harmless enthusiasm. Then he started showing up. I saw him in the audience during a panel I did for fans. He was in the front row, his eyes fixed on me the entire time. I recognized him instantly from the photo he had enclosed with his latest letters. Later that week, he was outside the cafe I visited every morning. I came home one evening and found a note tucked under my doormat. He apologized for intruding, but said he just had to let me know how much he cared. The handwriting matched the letters. I hired private security. They stayed outside the house and followed me to events. It helped for a while. The sightings stopped and I felt like I could breathe again. Then my mother got a phone call. A man asked about me, claiming to be a reporter. He was polite, even charming, but his questions were invasive. She hung up on him. Days later, my sister received a package at her office. It was filled with photos of her, taken without her knowledge. I demanded my publicist take action. She assured me she'd hired someone to handle the situation and keep me safe. She promised me it was under control, but it wasn't. One night I woke to the sound of glass shattering. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. Dozens of messages from an unknown number. They were photos of me, taken through my own windows. I could see myself in some, lying in bed, completely unaware. The police came and searched the property. They found nothing. Days later, the truth came out in the most horrifying way. My publicist let it slip during a heated conversation. The stalker wasn't just some deranged fan. She had hired him. It was supposed to be a publicity stunt, a way to keep me in the headlines. She didn't think he'd go this far. It started as a normal night out with friends. I'd stayed a little longer than I planned, and by the time I decided to head home, the streets were quiet. I called for a taxi, relieved when one pulled up almost immediately. The driver looked ordinary, middle-aged, wearing a plain jacket, and didn't say much as I got in. Everything seemed fine. The city lights blurred past the window, and I leaned back, tired but comfortable. Then I realized the route wasn't familiar. We were heading down streets I didn't recognize, away from the city. I sat up, suddenly alert, and asked where we were going. The driver didn't answer. I tried again, louder this time, but he just kept driving. The doors locked with a soft click, and my stomach dropped. The streets grew darker, the buildings thinning out until there was nothing but open road. Panic set in. I banged on the window, shouted for him to stop. He didn't even flinch, his hands steady on the wheel. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. The road stretched on, endless and empty, and was trapped. After some time, headlights appeared in the distance, a police car. Relief flooded me as it pulled up behind us, lights flashing. The driver slowed, then stopped. He unlocked the doors, and I scrambled out of the car as soon as the officer approached, my legs shaky. The officer took me aside, calm and professional. He asked a few questions, reassured me that I was safe, and offered to drive me home. The taxi driver didn't say a word as the officer led me to the police car. As we drove, I finally began to relax. The officer chatted lightly, trying to put me at ease. Then, almost offhandedly, he mentioned something strange. No taxis operate in this area after midnight. The listing photos had shown a clean, modern space, a place where we could relax for a few nights. The host wasn't there to greet us. A key had been left in a lockbox, along with a note taped to the door, "Enjoy your stay." We unpacked quickly. The place was cold, the air a bit stale. It was just a weekend, so we didn't mind. The door locks were strange, simple, old-fashioned ones with no deadbolt. The windows creaked when touched, barely catching when closed. The first night I woke in the dark. The sound was faint, like wood shifting under weight. I sat up, heart pounding, staring at the door. It was closed. My partner mumbled something in their sleep, and I forced myself to lie back down. In the morning, things felt slightly off. A bag was unzipped on the floor, though neither of us had used it since unpacking. A sweater of mine lay draped over the chair, though I was certain I had folded it and put it away. My partner joked about me sleepwalking. I didn't laugh. The second night I slept fitfully, waking to faint noises, small shifts, soft clicks. When I woke in the morning, my phone had been moved from the nightstand to the kitchen counter. My partner's shoes, left neatly by the door, were gone. We found them by the foot of the bed. The third morning I discovered a small camera in the air vent above the bed. I stared at it, heart racing. My partner pulled me away, promising to report it to the host and Airbnb. We didn't stay another night. We left early, driving straight home. Hours later, I received an email. The subject line was my name. Attached were photos, images of us sleeping, shots of me brushing my hair, a video of my partner standing by the window. None of it was taken with our devices. The host's profile vanished from the Airbnb site before we could report him. The first time I noticed a child missing, it didn't immediately raise any alarm. Summer camp is chaotic at the best of times. Kids wandering off to the lake, hiding in the woods during a game of manhunt, or just losing track of time at the arts and crafts cabin. But when I checked the roster and realized Emily wasn't accounted for anywhere, unease settled in. The camp owner, Mr. Hayes, said her parents had picked her up earlier that day. I didn't remember seeing them, but I was busy with other kids. I let it go. The second disappearance came a few nights later. This time it was Peter, one of the younger campers. His bunkmate claimed he was there when lights went out, but by morning Peter and his belongings were gone. Again, Mr. Hayes had an answer. Peter's parents had supposedly come to collect him after some family emergency. No fuss, no paperwork, just gone. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I started keeping a closer eye on the kids. I worked the night shifts in the cabins after that, making rounds to ensure everyone was accounted for. The camp was eerily quiet at night, with only the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. One night I woke to a strange hum vibrating through the air, low and steady. I slipped out of my bunk and followed the noise, heading towards the edge of the campgrounds. That's when I saw lights. Pulsing white beams cutting through the treetops, too bright and controlled to be flashlights. The hum grew louder as I crept closer until I came upon the clearing where the camp storage shed sat. Mr. Hayes was there, standing stock still in the glow of those beams, his face lit with an expression I can only describe as worshipful. I stayed hidden, barely daring to breathe. Then I saw them. They were tall and gaunt, with thin limbs and elongated heads. Their skin shimmered faintly under the light, a sickly metallic grey. One of them held a small figure in its grasp, a child, limp. It was one of the missing campers, I was sure of it. The creature turned towards the light, and in an instant both it and the child vanished into the beam, swallowed up as if they'd never been there. I stumbled back to my cabin in a daze, heart pounding. The hum faded, and the forest returned to its unsettling silence. I wanted to wake someone, to shout what I'd seen, but who would believe me? The only person with any authority was Mr. Hayes, and he was clearly part of this, whatever this was. The next morning, I pretended everything was normal. I kept my head down, watching Mr. Hayes closely. He was calm, as if nothing had happened. Another camper had gone missing overnight, a girl named Mia. Mr. Hayes claimed her parents had taken her home due to homesickness. I spent that night barricading the cabin, piling furniture against the door and keeping the kids close. But the hum returned, stronger this time. The lights swept through the trees, finding the cabin despite my efforts. The door didn't burst open, it simply disappeared, like it was dissolved into nothing. The beam flooded the cabin, blinding me as the children screamed. I felt a searing heat on my skin, and then blackness. I woke alone, lying in the clearing where the shed had stood. The children were gone. The camp was quiet, abandoned. Mr. Hayes was nowhere to be found. When I stumbled into the nearby town for help, no one recognized the name of the camp. No one had heard of it. When we set out for our hiking trip, the wilderness felt like freedom. 5 of us, all seasoned hikers, had been planning the expedition for months. The trail was remote and rugged, cutting through dense forests and rocky outcroppings. It was exactly the kind of adventure we craved. The hermit was the first sign that things weren't right. We encountered him on the 3rd day, where the trail narrowed and twisted around a cliff face. He emerged from the shadows like a ghost, weathered and wild-eyed, his tattered clothes blending into the earth. There was something unhinged about him, a desperation in the way he watched us. He didn't say much, but what little he did mutter was unsettling. Warnings to leave the area, to turn back. We laughed it off, joking about crazy mountain folk as we pressed on, but I couldn't shake the way he'd looked at us, like he knew something terrible. I figured it was just paranoia, the isolation playing tricks on my mind. The first disappearance happened that night. Emily had wandered off to collect water from a nearby stream. She was gone longer than expected, but none of us panicked at first. It wasn't until hours had passed that we realized something was wrong. We scoured the area with torches, calling her name until our voices were hoarse. There was no sign of her, no footprints, no struggle, nothing. By morning, our group was subdued, the light-hearted banter replaced by anxiety. Dan, the leader of our group and the one who'd planned the trip, insisted we continue. He argued that Emily had probably gotten lost and would find her way back to the trail. Something about his calmness didn't feel right, but he was experienced and we trusted him. The next night, Sam disappeared. He'd been sitting by the fire, poking at the embers, when he suddenly announced he was going to collect more wood. We waited for him to return, but like Emily, he never did. That was when the fear began to set in. 2 people missing, no trace, no explanation. We argued over what to do, whether to stay put or head back the way we came. Dan was insistent we press forward, claiming we were closer to the end of the trail than to where we'd started. His logic was sound, but his tone was cold, detached, like he was more annoyed than worried. I didn't sleep that night. Every rustle of the trees, every snap of a branch made my heart race. The next morning I woke to find Mark gone. That was the breaking point. There were only 2 of us left now, me and Dan. I wanted to go back, to retrace our steps, but Dan wouldn't hear of it. He was eerily calm, almost smug, as if he had everything under control. It wasn't until later that day that I found something I wasn't supposed to see. A clearing off the main trail, hidden by dense underbrush. It looked like an old campsite, scraps of fabric, rusted tools, and a crude fire pit. But then I noticed the bones. They were scattered haphazardly, some partially buried, others picked clean. Human bones. My stomach turned and my first thought was the hermit, but as I examined the site, something didn't add up. Among the bones were items that didn't belong. Emily's scarf, Sam's water bottle, Mark's watch. I realized the truth too late. Dan had been leading us into the wilderness, not to experience its beauty, but to trap us in its isolation. The hermit's warnings hadn't been about the woods, they'd been about Dan. When I turned back, Dan was there, watching me with a smile that made my blood run cold. He didn't need to say anything. I knew he wasn't going to let me leave. I ran through the forest. Somewhere behind me, I could hear him calling my name, his voice calm, almost playful. The wilderness felt infinite. I don't think I'll make it out. It was meant to be a simple train ride, just a leg of our journey across the countryside. The four of us, me, Ellie, Dan and Mark, had spent the day exploring small towns and taking photos. By the time we boarded the late-night train, we were all exhausted, but the camaraderie kept us going. The carriage was half empty, lit by dim yellow lights that flickered occasionally as the train wound through the darkness. The clatter of the wheels against the tracks was almost hypnotic, and soon the lively chatter between us turned to murmurs. I must have drifted off at some point. The exhaustion crept up on me, and the gentle sway of the train lulled me into a shallow sleep. When I woke up, the carriage was quiet. The first thing I noticed was the absence of voices. I turned in my seat, expecting to see my friends stretched out, maybe half asleep themselves, but their seats were empty. I called out, my voice breaking the silence, but there was no response. The train hadn't stopped while I was sleeping, I was sure of it. I hadn't heard the screech of brakes or the hiss of opening doors. They couldn't have gotten off. I stood up, scanning the carriage, expecting to see them further down, maybe grabbing a snack from the dining car. But the other passengers, the scattered few who had been on when we boarded, stared at me blankly as if I was speaking a foreign language. I asked around if anyone had seen my friends, but no one remembered seeing Ellie, Dan or Mark. Panic set in quickly. I moved from carriage to carriage, my heart pounding in my chest, calling their names, searching for any sign of them, but they were gone. The train stretched out endlessly, each carriage identical to the last, and I couldn't find any evidence they'd ever been there. Maybe I'd missed something, that maybe they had gotten off at a stop I hadn't noticed, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. In desperation, I approached one of the conductors. He checked his list of tickets, frowning as he told me there were no records of Ellie, Dan or Mark. He stared at me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, as if he thought I was confused or unwell. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew they had been here. As the train sped through the night, I returned to my seat, my mind racing. I combed through my bag, looking for anything that might prove that they had been with me. Ellie's scarf, Dan's sketchbook, Mark's camera. But all their things were gone. The seats they had occupied looked untouched, as though no one had ever sat there. When the train finally pulled into a station, I bolted for the door, stumbling onto the platform. The fresh air hit me like a slap, but it did little to calm the growing terror inside me. The station was empty, and as the train departed behind me, I filed a report with the authorities, but they found nothing. No evidence of my friends ever boarding the train, no CCTV footage, no ticket records, nothing. It was as if they'd been erased. When we first saw the house, it felt like stepping into a dream. A spacious 4-bedroom on the outskirts of town, tucked away in a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by towering oaks. The asking price seemed too good to be true, but the agent assured us the owner was simply eager to sell after a divorce. The walls were freshly painted, the kitchen was modern, and the garden stretched out farther than we could have hoped for. It was perfect. We moved in within 2 weeks, barely able to believe our luck. The first few days were a blur of unpacking, settling in, and marveling at how everything had fallen into place. It felt like we'd finally found somewhere we could call home. I started to grow a sense of being watched. I dismissed it as paranoia, the new house, the unfamiliar layout, the creaks and groans of settling wood, but the feeling persisted, especially when I was alone. I'd glance over my shoulder while folding laundry or pause in the middle of cooking, certain I had seen a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. One night, as I lay in bed, I noticed a faint clicking sound. It seemed to come from the corner of the room near the ceiling. I assumed it was an issue with the heating system, but the next morning, when I went to investigate, I found a tiny hole in the plaster, a pinprick no larger than the tip of a pen. I didn't think much of it until I noticed another in the living room, this one near the bookshelf, then another in the bathroom just above the shower. I climbed up on a chair with a torch and peered into one of the holes. There, glinting faintly in the dark, was a lens. Hidden cameras. My stomach twisted. I checked the other holes, finding the same thing in each, cameras meticulously hidden in the walls. There was one in every room, even the children's bedrooms. I called my partner, and together we began tearing through the house, uncovering more and more cameras. Each discovery felt like a violation. We found tiny wires running through the walls, leading to a locked cabinet in the basement. When we forced it open, we found a network of recording equipment, all powered by an external power source and connected to a server we couldn't access. The police arrived within hours, and their faces said everything we needed to know. This wasn't a normal case. They took the equipment as evidence and assured us they'd investigate, but their reassurances felt hollow. The damage was done. Someone had been watching us since the day we moved in. Every moment, every private conversation, every vulnerable second. We spent that night at a hotel, too shaken to stay in the house. As I lay in the unfamiliar bed, the realization struck me like a punch to the gut. Whoever set up those cameras hadn't needed to break in. They had access all along. The next day we changed the locks and installed a security system. It felt like shutting the barn door after the horse had bolted, but we were desperate to reclaim some sense of control. Days turned into weeks and we tried to move on. The police had no leads, and the house, for all its invasive secrets, was still ours. But then the photos started appearing. The first was slipped through the letterbox, a candid shot of our family sitting in the living room, laughing over a board game. It was recent, taken just days before we discovered the cameras. The second arrived in the post, addressed to me personally. It was a picture of my son sleeping, his small face illuminated by the glow of his nightlight. The third was left on the windscreen of our car. It was me, standing in the kitchen, staring directly into the lens of a camera I hadn't even known was there. We stopped feeling safe after that. We stopped feeling anything except hunted. Whoever had set up those cameras wasn't done with us. They wanted us to know they were still watching, still there, just beyond our reach. Last night I woke to find a message scrawled in black marker across the bathroom mirror. "You're living in my house." The police never found the previous owner. Or maybe they did, and they just didn't tell us. And I've always been an outdoor enthusiast, the kind of person who thrives on fresh air, aching legs, and the satisfaction of reaching a peak or finding a hidden trail. I'd planned this trip with 3 friends for months, a long hike through the backcountry of a remote national park, a place where phone service is a laughable dream and you're left with just your wits, your map, and the promise of untouched nature. We set out on a bright, crisp morning, the forest alive with bird calls and the crunch of frost underfoot. The first 2 days went off without a hitch. We navigated old trails, pitched our tents under towering trees, and swapped stories over the flicker of a campfire. Everything was perfect, until we decided to deviate from the main route. On the 3rd day, we stumbled across an unmarked trail, barely noticeable beneath years of overgrowth. It felt like a secret, an adventure waiting to be had. Curiosity won over caution, and we veered off course. By midday, the trail faded entirely, leaving us picking our way through dense forest. That's when we met him. He appeared from nowhere, standing just a few feet from us without making a sound. He was gaunt, his clothes tattered, and his eyes were wild and unfocused. We thought he might be a fellow hiker in trouble. His voice was low and strained, his words disjointed, but his message was clear. We weren't supposed to be here. He told us to turn back. We tried to explain ourselves, to ask questions, but he didn't stick around. 1 minute he was standing in front of us, the next he was gone, disappearing into the trees. Not wanting to let the encounter ruin the trip, we pressed on, rationalizing that he was probably just some eccentric loner living off the grid. That night we set up camp in a small clearing. None of us mentioned it, but we were all on edge, jumping at every crack of a twig. Around midnight, I woke to an odd noise, like someone dragging something heavy through the underbrush. I poked my head out of the tent, but there was nothing there, just the swaying of branches in the wind. The next morning, Jack was gone. His sleeping bag was still zipped up, his boots sitting neatly by the tent entrance, but he wasn't there. We thought he'd gone to relieve himself, but after an hour of shouting his name and scouring the immediate area, it became clear he wasn't coming back. We debated what to do, stay put and wait or keep moving. In the end, we packed up and carried on, hoping to find a ranger station or some sign of civilization. By late afternoon, we realized Kate was missing too. She'd been walking just ahead of me, her orange backpack standing out like a beacon against the green forest. I turned away for only a moment to adjust my pack, and when I looked back, she was gone. No sound, no struggle, just gone. Panicked, we screamed her name, retraced our steps, and searched until our voices were hoarse. That night it was just me and Ben. We didn't sleep. We didn't even bother with the tents, choosing instead to huddle by the fire, gripping our knives like they'd protect us from whatever was out there. All around us, all we could hear was rustling leaves and snapping branches. At some point, exhaustion overtook me and I must have dozed off. When I woke, the fire had burned down to embers and Ben was gone. His pack, his jacket, everything. The only trace of him was a single set of footprints leading into the trees. I didn't bother calling out this time. By now, I knew I was alone, that something, someone, was hunting us. I grabbed my things and started running, my only goal to get out of the forest alive. As dusk fell, I reached the edge of the woods where the trees thinned and the landscape opened up into rolling hills. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I glanced back one last time, and there, at the tree line, was the man we'd met. He was watching me. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing on the side of an old dirt road where a passing car finally picked me up. I reported everything to the authorities, but they found no trace of my friends, no unmarked trail, and no sign of the man. The bus rumbled to a stop, its headlights cutting through the foggy street. I barely caught it, sprinting from the pub where I'd lost track of time. My breath puffed in the cold night air as I climbed aboard, nodding to the driver, who didn't acknowledge me. The interior was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering faintly as if struggling to stay alive. The passengers sat in silence, staring straight ahead. Their postures were stiff, their faces shadowed, and no one glanced in my direction. I moved down the aisle, scanning for an empty seat. When I passed someone, they subtly shifted away, turning their heads as if avoiding me. It was unsettling. I settled into a seat near the back, across from a man in a trench coat and hat pulled low over his face. His hands gripped the edge of his seat tightly, knuckles pale. He never moved, never blinked, just stared straight ahead, as if trying to will himself invisible. The bus jerked forward and the city outside slipped by in blurred streaks of light. The street seemed emptier than usual, almost abandoned, as if the world outside had been hollowed out. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I shouldn't be here. My fellow passengers sat still, their faces devoid of expression, like mannequins in a shop window. I tried to distract myself, glancing out the window, but the reflections in the glass caught my attention. The passengers didn't look right. Their images were distorted, faint, almost transparent, while mine was clear, sharp, and vivid. It didn't make sense. I turned back, studying them more closely. No one moved, not even to shift in their seats or scratch an itch. Their stillness wasn't human, it was absolute, like statues carved from stone. The bus stopped again, the doors hissing open, but no one boarded. The driver didn't seem to notice, staring blankly at the road ahead. The passengers remained frozen, their gazes fixed forward. But then I noticed something else. My reflection wasn't the only clear one. In the window near the front, a figure stood watching me. They weren't on the bus, but their presence was undeniable. The shadowy shape leaned closer, its face obscured by the haze of condensation on the glass. The bus jolted and I turned, expecting to see someone approaching, but the aisle was empty. The passengers remained still, ignoring me entirely. My chest tightened, breath hitching as a memory surfaced. The screech of tires, the blinding flash of headlights, the bone-jarring impact. It hit me like a wave, drowning me in cold realization. I'd been crossing the road. I had seen the car too late, felt its weight slam into me. I remembered the metallic taste of blood, the ground rushing up to meet me, and then nothing. Now I was here on this bus, surrounded by silent, unmoving passengers who refused to look at me. The shadow in the window wasn't outside anymore. It was inside, moving closer, its shape shifting and flickering like a dying flame. The truth settled over me, suffocating and undeniable. I didn't belong here, but neither did they. This wasn't a bus, it was a ferry, and its passengers weren't going home. The figure loomed over me, its face an unreadable void. The lights flickered again, plunging the bus into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the passengers had turned. They were all staring at me now. I never thought I'd find myself wrapped up in a mystery like this. I followed countless influencers. She was one of the biggest names in the travel world. Let's call her Mia. With millions of followers, she made exploring forgotten corners of the world seem glamorous, even magical. Mia began her series on abandoned tourist attractions. Her captions were poetic, but her photos had a melancholy edge. Empty fairgrounds, crumbling castles, overgrown boardwalks. She seemed obsessed with one location in particular, an abandoned amusement park nestled deep in some remote forest. She called it Elysium Park. Her excitement about it was infectious. Her posts about the park started normal enough, rusted rides reclaimed by nature, eerie photos of ticket booths and cracked clown statues. One post, a selfie taken under a decrepit roller coaster, had an unsettling caption. "I'm not alone out here." Fans assumed she was being playful, but looking at it now, her expression seemed scared. The comments exploded with theories. Was it a ghost, a stalker, or just local wildlife? She didn't address it. Her live streams were stranger still. One showed her exploring a decrepit funhouse. The signal kept glitching and her voice sounded distorted at times. At one point, the camera panned across a cracked mirror, and I swear you could see a figure standing behind her, a dark silhouette, still as death. She didn't notice. Her laughter felt forced, her usual enthusiasm dulled. The final live stream came 2 days before she vanished. Mia was walking through the overgrown park at dusk, narrating as always. Her voice was shaky, her sentences disjointed. She muttered something about hearing footsteps. The camera jerked wildly at one point and she froze, staring off into the shadows. She whispered, "Who's there?" before cutting the stream abruptly. Her Instagram stories from that night showed cryptic shots, a broken carousel lit by her torchlight, a long corridor lined with shattered mirrors, a close-up of a locked gate with the caption, "I'm locked in." That was the last anyone heard from her. When she didn't post the next day, fans assumed she was taking a break, but by day 3, her followers were frantic. Someone noticed she hadn't checked into her next destination. Her family got involved, police were contacted, but no one could figure out where she'd gone. That's when people started digging. Fans dissected every post, every live stream. Some noticed what looked like a figure peering through a window, shadows that didn't match her movements, comments she never replied to. Someone found an old urban legend about Elysium Park, a caretaker who refused to leave after the park's closure, living in the ruins, chasing off trespassers. Then there were the coordinates. In her final story, someone spotted GPS data in the corner of the screen. A group of local fans went to the park to search, but they didn't find Mia. What they did find was worse. Her backpack was hidden in the funhouse, wedged under a pile of rotting debris. Inside was her phone, dead but intact. The last photo on it sent shivers down my spine. A blurry shot of the funhouse entrance at night with a figure standing just inside the doorway. Since then, the park has been closed off by authorities. Rumors swirl about what was found during their investigation, evidence of someone living there, strange markings carved into the walls, bloodstains that didn't match Mia's DNA. And then there's the most chilling part. A new account popped up on Instagram last week, posting cryptic photos of abandoned places with captions eerily similar to Mia's style. The account has no followers, no tags, and no explanation, but the first photo was of Elysium Park, taken from inside the funhouse. I don't know if it's her, someone playing a sick joke, or something worse.